Hi, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My name is Jenn Houtz, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the AOS Student Affairs Committee. And we are very excited to continue with our monthly series. So this past year and a half, there's been a subcommittee of people within the Student Affairs Committee that have tried to put on these professional development events such as this one. And today we'll be focusing on how to review manuscripts for AOS journals. And we are joined by a selection of different editors of the two AOS journals. So I will just go ahead and call on each of the panelists, and if they could say their name, where they're currently at, and their position at whichever AOS journal they're affiliated with. So I will first call on Catherine.
Hi there, it's really nice to see you all. My name's Catherine Lindell. I'm the editor-in-chief of Ornithological Applications, and I am in East Lansing, Michigan right now.
Yeah, go ahead, Wesley.
Oh, okay, no, I didn't want to jump ahead. I just didn't want to forget to unmute myself, but my name is Wesley Hochachka. I am one of the senior editors working under Scott Sillett with Ornithology. And I'm at the Lab of Ornithology at Cornell as a senior research associate.
Great, thank you. And Scott?
Hey folks, I'm Scott Sillett. I'm editor-in-chief of Ornithology and am sitting today in surprisingly warm Tacoma Park, Maryland, where it is an early springtime.
Okay, fantastic. And am I missing any other panelists?
I mean, you could, Carlos could introduce himself. He's the editor of Ornithology and Neotropical, so he would have a lot of insights about reviewing as well.
Yeah, definitely. Carlos, go ahead.
Yes, editor of Ornithology and Neotropical for the last 1.5 years. I'm based in Venezuela. And I wasn't on the panel. I was not on the panel. I just wanted to hear what you have to say. But I can say something, I will.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us. We love impromptu panelists. But okay, so the way this is going to work is first we'll have some pre-supplied questions that I'll just open up the floor, and whichever panelist wants to give an answer can go ahead. And then we'll open it up around 5:40 p.m. Eastern time for audience questions. And you can do this by either raising your hand or putting an asterisk in a chat. And then I will call on you and you can ask your question. Or if you don't feel comfortable asking aloud, we can also take anonymous questions and you can submit that to Maina Handmaker privately. Oh, and I see we were just joined by Sabrina. So Sabrina, can you introduce yourself as a panelist?
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm a bit late. Zoom decided to update. I'm one of the senior editors for Ornithology, and my background is in conservation genetics.
Great. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. So our first question is, when and how do journals start asking students to review manuscripts? And can I reach out to journals telling them that I'd be willing to do reviews? So anyone that wants to answer can unmute themselves and give their opinion.
Okay, I'll just jump in here. So, you know, a little while ago, we started at the AOS journals a student reviewer program. And so this is for people who really don't have hardly any experience reviewing. And what you can do is you can go to our submission system, Editorial Manager, and you can register as a reviewer. And then you would send an email to Mark Penrose, AOS Pubs, at AmericanOrnithology.org. And this is all, there's a blog post about this new student reviewer program. So if you need those details, you can go to the blog post, search for student reviewers, and And so then you'll be in our system. And we just sent an email to our associate editors encouraging them to choose student reviewers along with the normal 2 reviewers that they would get. And so what this lets you do is you'll see the other reviews, you'll see the manuscript, you will write a review yourself. And so the editor or associate editor will have more information this way, and it will let you see how the process works and how other reviewers write the review. This is all blind. We are blind, double blind both ways. And so I think that's a really nice thing that we've started. You can also ask your advisor, if they regularly review things for the AOS journals, we do have, students can help them review, and we ask reviewers if they've had a student help with a review. So that's a really good way to get some experience too. And I'll stop talking for a minute and let my other co-conspirators chime in.
I think you covered it, Catherine. I don't have anything else to add about asking to review, other than don't be shy. If you feel you want to review a paper, you're ready to review, then get in there and sign up. We're always looking for reviewers.
Yeah, and I same thing. I would encourage you to sign up for that. The other really handy thing about that is you get to see the other reviews when they're all back, and so you can compare what you found to be a problem with what other more experienced reviewers have found to be problems with the paper.
Yeah, and I want to second what Catherine said about asking your supervisors. I mean, I don't know about the other panelists, but my first review was literally a paper that was handed to me by my PhD supervisor. So it's a way of getting experience, and I mean, a lot of supervisors, I'm not sure how many people actually, if they're given a paper, they think automatically about whether their students could review or not. So a gentle reminder should be a very welcome, because a lot of people are reviewing far more papers than they really have time to do properly. So yeah, definitely talk with your supervisors about the potential.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So next question is, are there any strategies or tips that you all have for those who are writing a review for the first time, and what to include in a review to be most helpful to the editor and the
authors? For starters, I think that I can't necessarily give very specific suggestions, but maybe to start, remember that you've got 2 people that you're talking to when you're writing a review. One is the editor or the editors, and the other is the author or the authors. And you can say slightly different, you should be saying slightly different things to the 2 of them. And from an editor's perspective, mostly, I'm thinking about, in some cases, a lot of cases for the authors, maybe if you think about classifying any of the comments that you have into 3 general classes. The first is, what do you absolutely think needs to be modified in a manuscript to make it publishable? And some unfortunate cases, the answer is that there's nothing that can be done, and that a paper should be declined for publication. But it's really helpful to the editor to see your opinions on this, and it's really helpful to authors so that they know, this is something I need to spend a lot of time, or most of my time, revising a manuscript in order to make it publishable. The second class are things that aren't necessarily absolutely essential, but can turn a manuscript from being an okay manuscript into something that's easier to read, more fun, enjoyable to read, where it's easier for a reader to extract information from it. So things like the introduction. Does the introduction or the abstract just reach out and grab you and make you want to read the paper. So you can start out with a general impression. Is this an exciting paper, or am I bored with it? And that's not what you write to editor authors. It's like, why do you have these feelings? And if you can analyze that and then communicate that to the editor and the authors, then I think that is sort of elevating manuscripts overall. And then the minor suggestions, the third class. But that's being able to see or have the editor can look at your comments and then re-emphasize in the letter to the authors, the decision letter, what that also highlight and repeat and emphasize the points that really should be concentrated on. So the idea is, what can you do to help the authors to the greatest extent possible? So that in general terms would be my suggestion.
Yeah, another thing just to add to that, there's this website called criticalthinking.org, and they have this list of intellectual criteria standards for critical thinking. And so I usually keep that in mind. And I usually start when I'm reviewing a paper with their last criterion, which is this a significant question, right? And so if you're, say, providing a methodology for identifying hybrids of two species, that somebody has already done that and there's only 3 known cases of that, I would say that's a non-significant question, and I would probably desk reject that. On the other hand, if you're looking at something like, if you come up for an explanation as to why it is that bats are the origin for so many zoonoses, that is a very significant question that will be of interest to a large number of people. And then the next thing I usually look at are the data. You have sufficient sample sizes. Has it been sampled spatially or temporally in a way that is going to lead to robust conclusions? And if those 2 criteria aren't met, then probably the paper isn't going to get very far along. And then other aspects of that would be, the clarity of the writing, the breadth and the depth of the research, and those kinds of things.
Yep. Sabrina and Wesley, I agree with everything you all said. I think in my mind, writing a review is like having a conversation with somebody. You obviously want to be respectful. And even though you may not sign your review, maybe you'll never sign a review. Even when you've won the Nobel Prize, you're still not going to sign reviews. That's fine. But always write your review as if you're going to sign it, as if you're going to walk into that person's office or house, sit down and talk to them about their paper, right? The key is to be respectful and collegial about it. Sometimes papers they're annoying because the analyses are wrong, or the writing doesn't make sense, or whatever. But it's never the place of the reviewer to chastise an author or to be directly, rudely negative. It should always be a conversation. And those types of reviews not only are nicer, but I think they provide better input to authors. They lead to better papers than just highly critical reviews.
Yeah, I'm happy with what everyone has said so far. Yeah, just focusing on the big issues is most important. And the minor concerns they're nice if you can get to them, but not as important. I guess the one thing I would add is to use examples from the paper. So for example, if you say the introduction is quite unfocused, you might say, for example, you touch on these 4 different topics, but you don't develop them in any degree, and it doesn't seem like they are closely aligned with the main theme of the paper. So examples help to explain to the author what you mean.
Yeah, Catherine, you've just reminded me of one other thing that I often see, where there's quite a mismatch between the introduction and the discussion. And I feel like this often happens with thesis chapters, where you started a project, 4 or 5 years ago, and this was how it was going. And then all these other things changed over time. And so the discussion doesn't really reflect the introduction anymore. So just make sure that, if you're covering sort of, certain ideas in the introduction, that you revisit those ideas in the discussion so that there's cohesion between those two parts of the paper.
And there's something else that Sabrina had just mentioned in passing, and that was the term desk rejection. So a lot of journals now, just to save wear and tear on the reviewers, among other reasons, the editors are going to read manuscripts and decide whether they should even be sent out for review or not. So by the time a manuscript would get to you as a reviewer, you can assume that it passes some basic minimum criteria of seeming like it could be published. And if you go in with that attitude, sort of thinking of things that way, shape your review to, again, as I said, improve what's already there. Is there anything you can do to help the authors?
Okay, thank you all. Those were great answers. So our next question is, how do you self-assess if you're qualified to review a manuscript? So for example, if you're asked to review a manuscript and the authors use a method such as software, statistical analysis that you've never used before, are you still qualified to do the review?
Yeah, I'll start out with that one. It's a tough one. I think don't be dissuaded from doing review if you don't understand a statistical test or you're not familiar with the software per se. Those are tools to help us understand the data. If the manuscript is very much based on some complex analytical approach or other numerical method, then maybe you wouldn't want to do it. But I think if you've written a paper or two or three, I think it's worth starting to do reviews, because by reviewing papers, you become a better writer. And also remember that, especially if you come in as a student reviewer, there's going to be 2 other reviews on the paper as well. And by participating in the review process, you're getting to see what other people point out. So my attitude is, when in doubt, review a paper. It's a good thing to do.
And when you're doing that, it doesn't hurt to actually just write in the letter to the editor, the comments to the editor, that you're not familiar with a method. That's perfectly fine. And that's actually extra information for the editor, who can look at that and then balance your comments with the comments of others, and maybe realize that, if the method's so important, maybe we need to find an additional reviewer. But the flip side of not knowing a method is that if you aren't familiar with a certain method, it's still there's valuable information in how you perceive the method in the paper. Have the authors written about methods in a way that you could actually think that you understand not just what they did, but particularly why they did it. And maybe that's a more general comment about methods, where it can be valuable to readers if the author explains, I needed to do this. This is my goal, and therefore I use these particular methods. And in general, that will just make a paper more readable for everyone. So don't be, if it's something about one specific method and it's not the core, or if it's not a methodological paper developing a new method, then tell the editor what you feel you're comfortable assessing, and also what you're not comfortable assessing. And it's the jobs of the associate editor and the editor to take this into account and combine the information from the different reviewers in making their final decision.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so next question is, what constitutes a conflict of interest? So for example, I was asked to review manuscripts, and one of the authors is someone I've met before, such as met at a conference, or you went to the same undergrad institution. What constitutes a conflict of interest? Or would this even be a concern nowadays since most journals are double blind?
Right. So you raise a good point that we're double blind now. So oftentimes you will not know if you have a conflict of interest unless, I don't know, sometimes you can really tell who wrote a paper. I mean, but that's pretty unusual. I mean, sometimes people think they know and they don't really know. But so, you know, that is less of an issue with these blind reviews. But I would say I'm pretty careful about conflicts of interest. And I'm interested to hear what the other editors have to say on this too. But I was trying to think of a way to say it simply, but, you know, like if there's someone who wrote a paper and you kind of get a warm, fuzzy feeling when you think about them, or you get a feeling that's not so pleasant. I just feel like we're humans and anything like that can influence your evaluation of their work. I mean, if it's a very minor connection, you know, I don't think you have to worry about it, but I'm pretty careful about conflicts of interest and making sure there's not a likelihood that there's going to be some sway to your review given your acquaintance with the person.
Yeah, that is a tough one. The AOS does have a list of what they consider to be conflicts of interest for reviewing, and that's on the website somewhere, right, Catherine and Scott?
You know, we have this editorial conflict of interest, which we direct the associate editors to, but I was taking a look today, and you could use it, I think, for, you know, reviewer conflicts, potential conflicts too. So it's on our OUP site, and under one of the menus, there's editorial conflicts of interest. And that lays out there, for example, you know, your PhD student and the advisor, that's like a lifelong conflict of interest. You're not supposed to be reviewing your advisor's work, and they're not supposed to be reviewing your work even long after you've graduated. And other are more like a few years, but it would be a good thing to look at sometime.
Yeah, I kind of think of those as the official conflicts of interest, but the other ones I avoid are, you know, people who've been in the same lab as me. I just inherently are in favor of what they're doing most of the time. So I try and stay away from reviewing their papers, which is a bit rough sometimes because you're doing similar things. So of course, when people are looking for reviewers, you're going to get asked quite often to review papers from people who have been in your master's or your PhD labs. I mean, that's not an official one, but I just personally avoid that because for me, that is a conflict of interest.
Yeah, it's a challenge for sure. I think it's maybe I'm not as stern as Catherine about it, in part because I feel like when you go to an AOS meeting or another ornithology meeting, you realize that there aren't really that many of us out there. There's a small group of us who are ornithologists, and so you have to weigh your conflict, your perceived conflict with the need for science or the journals to get fair reviews. So I think it's also important to be able to give a fair review to someone, even if they're your friend. If they're your best friend, that's a conflict of interest. If it's someone who you palled around with 4 years ago, that's probably not. Yeah, Jose put our COI policy up there. Thank you for doing that. I think it's important to, if you have, as Catherine said, a feeling about an individual, then acknowledge it. The other thing that's wise to do is if you're asked to review a paper, even if it's double blind, you can write back to the editor who invited you and say, hey, just so you know, I worked with so-and-so who studied this species. I may have a conflict of interest, and and then it's the job of the editors to decide that, to adjudicate that issue. So don't review papers for your friends and family. You're eternally conflicted with your PhD advisor and with any PhD students who you have. 4 years for master's students, and then if you look at our policy there, it gives you more details. But I think, as in everything, when in doubt, ask. If you think you have a conflict, it's always worth asking and getting some guidance on it.
And also, sort of as part of the gray area, if you think that maybe you have a conflict, but it's sort of more on the side of you don't think you have a conflict, but you're not entirely sure, then that's another thing that can go into your comments to the editor. So this would be a case sort of less severe than anything that Scott talked about. Just like you've got a nagging feeling that you might be biased, either positive or negative. Acknowledge it, because, well, frankly, the longer you spend in a career in research, the more people you're going to know, to the point that if it's anybody you ever met at a conference, you couldn't review anything, and they couldn't review any of your work either. It's kind of an untenable situation, and that gets back to what, in some ways, to what Scott was saying about having a conversation with the authors. If it's somebody you met at a conference, if it's a positive feeling you have, sort of impression you have of a person, you'd want to actually have that conversation. And if you could do this for somebody where maybe, it's sort of a difference between a professional and a personal dislike. If there's something about a person's personality that to me is more of a strong conflict, in the sense that you're actually emotionally biased and potentially more blinded. If there's something about that you can actually take and reduce to a more cut and dried, it's not, I hate the methods you've chosen, but I think that there are issues potentially with this method, you need to discuss them in the paper. So you can actually, for cases where it's not sort of an emotional potential conflict, that might, hopefully people can work their way through those. For people who are, again, not really formally in conflict based on the journal's definition or this expansion of the journal's general definition.
Okay, great. Thank you all again for fantastic answers. Okay, I'm personally very excited about this question, but this is going to be particularly relevant, I think, for, let's say, PhD students or master's students who are early on and haven't had a chance to publish some of their work. But what happens if you receive a manuscript and the topic is scooping something that you're working on or about to publish? What should you do? Should you contact the editor? Are you allowed to tell your advisor that you just received a manuscript to review and talk about the content of the paper? So any advice on that particular scenario would be great.
Boy, that's a tough one. Yeah. I mean, generally, when you're invited to review a paper, you're asked to keep it confidential. That said, if you're a graduate student, you can ask your advisor, say, wow, these folks are doing exactly what I'm doing and they're 2 years ahead. What should I do? What you should not do is undermine their paper, of course. So if you have any doubts, any visceral reaction to, oh my gosh, I'm being scooped, you have a conflict of interest, turn it down. Just turn it down. When in doubt, turn a paper down. That's always fair to the other people. I think the grayer area comes, and this is where I'm curious what the other editors have to say, is, if you know the other lab, It's one of your former students or one of your colleagues, you know, and they're doing parallel work. You know, then it's a question of, gosh, should we be collaborating? I mean, this is just a challenging ethical universe, right? It's not very common in ornithology anyway. I mean, if we are working on, you know, COVID disease dynamics, we probably would be battling over this more. But I think my first reaction is, if you feel conflicted, you are. If you don't feel conflicted, if you think you can give a fair review, then give a fair review. And in your comments to the editor, acknowledge, like, I'm 2 years behind on this thing. I'm working on something similar. You know, that's the key to peer review, is to be fair and open and transparent. Even though it's double blind, you still want to be open about issues with the editor, because you want your colleagues, your peers out there to get the fairest review they can.
Yeah, I guess it depends a bit on the timing too. You know, if the paper about to be published is several years ahead of you, you know, 1 to 2, I mean, then it's going to be published before you publish anyway, right? So you would be able, once it's published, to cite it and to get in contact with the authors on it anyway. If it's a case where you're about to submit yourself and this paper is already submitted, then that timing makes it a lot trickier. But I agree with, you know, Scott, in the sense that if it's somehow going to be unfair to the authors, you having that knowledge, then you should step out.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add. The transparency is really important, as Scott mentioned.
Yeah, also, I don't have anything to add. It's maybe less complicated in a double-blind universe than it is if you knew the authors' names. You'd be, yeah, in some way, just basically, even in terms of like being tempted to contact people. And there's an extra layer now with this. If people are publishing sort of more competitively, there's the preprint process where people are effectively revealing themselves to their colleagues and potential competitors, and that's a whole other layer outside of the journal. So you might even find out that you already are aware of a paper that you've been asked to review, and yeah, you just, as Scott was saying, you have to assess whether you think you could give a fair review, and also make it clear to the editors whether you're feeling somewhat conflicted if you decide to go ahead with a review. And it is the editor's jobs to kind of try and mediate and oversee and integrate information and when coming up to a final decision.
Okay, thank you all for those responses. Yeah, I thought that was a really unique situation. But yeah, thank you for your insight on that. And okay, so our next question is, what kind of language should you use if, let's say, you're reviewing a manuscript and there's something inherently wrong with either the study design or the statistical analysis? So how can you constructively give feedback? Yeah, what kind of language should you use?
I try and put it in the form of questions, you know, because you might be making assumptions that are incorrect if you say this is wrong. More along the lines of, you know, can the authors explain why they use the statistical technique? Because normally people don't use that. Given these problems, they usually use this one instead. Please elaborate on your choice, defend your choice, and maybe think about trying this other methodology as well to see if you get consistent results.
And potentially you could, in some cases, the sort of language you could use, if you think that, say, an analysis is too simplistic, you can talk about suggestion considering alternative methods that might reveal a richer story or a clearer story. So couch it in the terms of, again, not saying something is bad, but saying, I think you can make this better. It's actually in general that's a good tone to take. What is it that the authors, you think that you could advise the authors to do to improve on what they already have written? But if something is, I mean, there is potential that data particularly are just fundamentally inadequate for a purpose. And definitely you can clearly communicate that to the editor in the letter to the editor. Please do it non-emotionally, or you're immediately going to sort of raise potentially a flag in the editor's mind. But yeah. That it's a really tough one, because you're sort of really, you don't want to crush a person, you don't want them to take something personally. So yeah, I think maybe Sabrina's suggesting couch it as a question. Are you sure that your data are actually capable of doing what you think they are doing, or you want them to do? And then it's the editor's responsibility again to take the information from you and from the other reviewers and lay out the decision and the reasons for the decision clearly, but also politely and respectfully.
Yeah, and to follow in on that too, as a reviewer, if you want the authors to do something, then you need to provide some detail as to what it is you want them to do. Like it isn't helpful to say you need some stats analyses here, because like Wes said, it might be a case that you can't perform those statistics on that type of data set. And so, what are you looking for? So be explicit about what you want to see in the paper, what specific tests, for instance.
Yeah, I agree. And when in doubt, if you're on the fence about, man, these data are rotten, but I don't want to be mean, how can I say it? Say it to the editor and let the editor do it. And that's not a cop-out. That's how it's done. Again, sometimes things are just wrong. Sometimes a study design just doesn't cut the mustard. It just doesn't. And there's no harm in saying that. You just want to be able to say it respectfully. And if you're unsure, or you're angry because the design is so bad, say it to the editors and let them get the word out.
I'll also just add, if you, I mean, not everyone can do this, but I mean, I have had reviewers put some code in, and it kind of makes, I think, the authors a little more likely to take the suggestions if they feel like the reviewer kind of knows what they're talking about to some degree and is willing to put a little effort in. So I'm not saying pages and pages of code, but like I've been on the receiving end of that kind of thing. Like, a reviewer said, I think you should do this. It would just take this little bit of code here. And so that can be, if you are able to do that, that can be helpful. And it kind of smooths over the review, I think, and makes people more likely to take your suggestion seriously.
Yeah, that's a great point. You're providing a review as an expert, and any advice you can give, code, citations, even a suggestion about how to rewrite a sentence or two, all those things are valuable, with the caveat that you don't want to write a 12-page review.
Yes. And we don't want to read them either.
Please, no.
Something I wanted to add to this, and I'm not sure what the other editors think, but I kind of feel like if I reject a paper, it's because I'm not generally supportive of it, and I can't see a way for it to get to a stage where I'm going to be generally supportive of it, right? But if I say, yeah, I think I would accept this with minor and major revisions, then I'm kind of saying to the authors, in general, I support your paper. And so I'm going to help you, get to that stage. And same thing with the reviewer. If you really don't support it, then don't be afraid to reject it. If you do support it, then provide help as to how that paper can get to a publishable stage.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. Thank you. I love the idea of providing code. I wish people would send me code when they review my papers. That's awesome.
It's such a humane thing to do.
Yeah. That's amazing. Okay, so thank you so much, panelists, for answering all those questions. So now I want to open it up to the audience. So feel free to either raise your hand and I can call on you to unmute yourself, or you can send it in the chat and we can ask for you. So I'll just go ahead and start with Damien's question. So is it ethical for an editor or reviewer to edit your paper and then recommend that you acknowledge their comments in the paper?
No.
Not by name.
Not by name. I mean, I have asked authors to please acknowledge, in your acknowledgements, please thank the associate editor or 2 external reviewers for their help, especially if the review was, particularly detailed and valuable. But yeah, it is not ethical to ask that your name be mentioned.
But I think it's perfectly appropriate and ethical to actually always acknowledge that if an editor or if the reviewers have been helpful in some way, if they read your paper once it's published, they'll know. Other people will know also that you're grateful for feedback from people. Yep. So I sometimes wonder about the ethics of not acknowledging reviewers.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a good thing to do. It's an extra sentence, and it's a nice gesture.
Yeah, Damien, if you have a follow-up question.
Yes, my name is Damien. I'm from Jamaica, the Caribbean. Just a question to the editors. Sometimes we in the Caribbean, some of the universities don't have some of the most up-to-date, well, I should say, find a nice way, equipment or some of the resources. And sometimes we are produce papers based on what we have. It's been reviewed internationally, I understand that. And sometimes I think when we are reviewing some of these papers, is there, I'm trying to find a very diplomatic way to put it. Sometimes we don't have much of the big resources. And some of us sometimes are judged at that level where, yeah, it's just what we have here. So I just wanted to bring that point out, that sometimes when you're reviewing some of the papers, that you have to put that in mind also. Just a comment I'm making here.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great comment. And I think that gets back to a point we've been making, that, peer review is a conversation. And at some level, it's also a negotiation. You get reviews back. You are allowed, when you submit your revisions, you're allowed to rebut comments from reviewers. And so if you think that a reviewer gave you negative comments because you're using an old method or an old machine or something, it's okay to push back on that. That's, no one should be offended by that. So, if it's a legitimate rebuttal, do so. They say, listen, yeah, my gizmo was 20 years old, but it's very accurate and it's fine. I think another, when you're reviewing papers or editing papers, you also want to be careful about sticking to, are the questions being asked and answered, even if the statistics might be older or an approach might be older. It's important that we're advancing the science.
I mean, there are going to be cases where lack of certain equipment just makes it not necessarily possible to answer some specific research questions.
Right.
But otherwise, throwing a lot of money at something isn't necessarily going to be a solution. It's possible for something to be elegantly simple, sort of requiring minimal equipment, and simple statistical analyses. And so there is a difference between elegantly simple and simplistic and overly simplistic. As long as the questions can be clearly answered with the data that are collected, I don't see a problem with that. There shouldn't be a problem with that, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. So this kind of relates to Tim's question in the chat, but we got another question about how in depth you should go in terms of the review. Should you be correcting grammar? Should you go through the references and make sure that they're correctly formatted, or should you just stick to the more big picture comments?
I would say stick to the big picture stuff. I mean, you don't want to be, you do, if you notice that references are missing from the list, okay, that should be something that's noted. And you can certainly make comments about how the paper needs more careful editing. Some of the sentence structure is off, or the grammar, but people, reviewers are still making comments. I just changed one the other day because someone said something like they need to get a native English speaker to read this and edit it. And so we don't want that kind of thing in reviews, because for one thing, you're making an assumption that someone's not a native English speaker. So you want to stay away from that kind of thing. But you can say if there needs to be some work on the writing, that is perfectly fine. I must say, I'm pretty willing, if I think a paper is good, to go through pretty carefully and do that kind of careful editing. So, I don't expect reviewers to do that.
Yeah, and the journals have copy editors too, or Oxford University Press. The papers go through lots of hands before they finally get published, and we do have professional copy editors who go through. They're not ornithologists, but they do understand rules of English grammar. And the language issue is a challenging one. What, as Catherine said, we don't want to scold anyone for not being a native speaker. When we have a paper that exceeds our editorial office's ability to line edit it, so it would be suitable for review a second time, well, then we'll tell authors that language editing services are available, and we provide a list of multiple places that people can go for a fee and get language editing if they need it. But yeah, as a reviewer, I would not encourage you to line edit things. If you're a co-author on a paper, that's when you line edit. If you're an editor, I generally, or if you're a reviewer, then no. If you're an editor, well, that's part of your job sometimes.
Yeah, maybe the big picture there is you were asked to review a paper not because you're the world's best grammarian. You were asked for your expertise on the contents.
Right.
Maybe the one thing to guard against, though, is possibly just shutting down if you're seeing something that takes more work. I don't know. I don't know how much this happens with reading, but sometimes I have seen people, when they're talked to with an accent that's obviously foreign, they stop hearing. And so guard against something like that psychologically reading. If it is not readable, in your opinion, let the editor know. But Otherwise,
Right.
look not at the words. Like every language has their own peculiarities going from some other language to English, but look at the contents. Are the contents well organized? Are the thoughts organized in a clear manner, even if the words aren't necessarily organized, sort of exactly appropriate? Or, you know, there could be cases where corrections, maybe if there's jargon that's being used incorrectly, just mention that. You know, typically the jargon used is this, not that. You want to make a point about some type of consistent grammatical mistakes, give examples. Don't edit the whole thing. That actually applies also for native English speakers too. It's not just an issue with people who do not speak English or have not learned English as their first language.
Yeah, to follow on with that comment, one of my pet peeves is actually when I know for a fact there are native English speakers on the paper and they clearly have not edited it for fluency before it's submitted. And in that case, I mean, I would say, look, you English speakers need to do your job here and fix these problems the next time you submit. You know, I just don't understand how someone can accept authorship and not even read it, apparently, for those kinds of errors. So if English isn't your first language and you have English co-authors, I would encourage them to say, please take a hard look at the English fluency on this before we submit. I'm counting on you to fix these problems because I don't see them.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, authorship's a privilege. So if someone's an author and you need their help, push them for it. Don't feel bad.
Okay, thank you all. I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 more questions. Sean, I'm going to ask one question from earlier in the chat and then I will call on you. But I'm going to ask Maina's question from the chat because I'm interested in this as well. But I know that AOS journals are double blind, so they keep their reviewers anonymous, but will authors be made aware if one of their reviewers is a student reviewer? Let's say if you signed up through AOS's program.
I don't think so. Catherine, are they?
I don't think so either. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know why we would do that.
No,
So-
that would be kind of, I think that'd be I wouldn't want to do it. You know, and if you have a paper come back from one of the AOS journals and you have 3 reviews, don't assume that one of them is a student review, because we often send the paper out to 3 reviewers in the hopes that at least 2 submit something. And sometimes we get 3, jackpot. So yeah, we, you know, if we're asking someone to review a paper, we value their input and we want to see it. We're not going to have an asterisk there.
Yeah. If anything, I might try to obfuscate who might be the student reviewer if I know that one of the reviewers is a student. Things like actually like deliberately emphasizing and reinforcing that their opinions on something are particularly valuable.
Yeah.
I'll remember to check with our managing editor, but yes, I'm quite sure we don't identify student reviewers.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. I am going to, Sean, would you like to ask your question?
I saw that Carlos had a question that might be more important to answer in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That sounds good. Okay. So do AOS journals favor receiving preprint manuscripts which have already been printed somewhere?
We take direct submission from BioArchive. So yeah, we encourage people to put your paper up on the BioArchive preprint server. And there's a functionality that you can directly submit to our journals from there. So we definitely are happy to do that.
Okay, fantastic.
There's a question in the chat from Jack about rebuttals.
Yeah. Yeah, if someone wants to address that, I can speak here. So as an editor, do you ever step in and reveal to the authors that you believe a suggestion or comment provided by a reviewer is incorrect or unnecessary, or do you let the authors make that decision on their own?
I do.
Yeah.
If I think it's blatantly wrong, I'll say something, but it's often, it's rare that a comment is made by a reviewer or an editor that I think is blatantly wrong. I mean, but the challenge is when one reviewer thinks it's great and another reviewer thinks it isn't, and you're trying to balance those points of view. But in the final decision letter, I think that we all may say, I particularly agree with comments from reviewer 2 about X, Y, and Z. You know, where you might emphasize what you think is most important, because in the end, you know, the editor makes the final decision about the paper.
Yeah, the other thing you can do if you disagree what another reviewer has said is just put it in the confidential comments to the editors, and, you know, along the lines of, I noticed that reviewer 1 suggested that they do this analysis, but I don't think that's appropriate because of ABCD, you know?
Yeah.
That would be in the case of a re-review.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a good point, Sabrina. I've seen that, you know, when a paper comes back for revision and one of the reviewers notes what a reviewer said in the previous round, they might say, oh, you know what, that's actually wrong, here's why. And I'm happy to have that kind of information, because, you know, you want to be sure that the product that we put out is solid.
And to continue on from what Scott said, yeah, I mean, I definitely at times have, in my letter to the authors, have tried to balance out if I'm thinking that, well, I try to word it more as emphasizing and de-emphasizing comments if I think that they're particularly important, not saying that something is, I don't think I've ever seen a case where I would say that's completely wrong, but just emphasizing that from my perspective, so that it's not just the authors who see it, but the reviewers, when they see the decision letter, understand that I'm taking responsibility for emphasizing something up or de-emphasizing something. So it's part of being an editor.
Sean, do you want to try and ask your question quickly?
Yeah, thanks. I wasn't sure how time limited we were, but thanks to the panelists, it's been really helpful. Yeah, my question is about positive comments on reviews. And I'm just wondering if panelists could discuss how useful positive comments are, not only for the anonymous comments to the editor that don't go to the author, but also how positive comments can be useful for the authors themselves.
I think they can be really useful. It can give someone a little glow amid all the criticism that they're getting. So I think that can be really helpful.
Yeah.
I'm also a strong proponent. When I review, I try and point out what I think the strengths of the paper are in the introductory paragraph. You know, this is a paper about this, these are the strengths, and then get into the major comments, because it also, like Catherine says, it gives people a little boost as they faced sometimes a long list of things to fix. And also it means that they keep doing the good things in their future papers, right? And maybe when they review, they try and do the same thing.
Yeah, if there's something that, I mean, really genuinely excites you or you thought was really great about a paper, let authors know about that.
Yeah.
You know, like, even if it's just it's more of a subjective thing. You know, I really like this paper because it would, I think, yeah, authors should appreciate that.
Yeah. Peer review is a slugfest. I mean, you're getting criticized page after page after page. I always appreciate a pat on the back. And I think it can also help structure a review to focus the comments, you know, acknowledge what's really good, point out what needs changed, and perhaps emphasize how addressing the concerns could elevate the paper more and better emphasize the strengths of the paper.
Okay, all right. Well, that is going to be our last question. I don't want to keep anyone longer than an hour, but thank you so much to all the participants for attending and for asking fantastic questions. And a special thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time out of their day to talk with us about strategies and best practices for reviewing for AOS journals. So this recording will be available on the AOS YouTube channel to AOS members. So be on the lookout for that if you'd like to rewatch it. And stay tuned also for other monthly series events by the Student Affairs Committee. So everyone have a fantastic night and thank you again.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody.
Thank you.